The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor, sending crystal shards across the bridal suite like frozen tears. Rachel stood in her wedding dress, staring at the crimson stains spreading across the pristine white silk where her sister had just hurled the glass of red wine. But instead of tears, a slow smile crept across her face, because what her sister didn't know was that Rachel had been expecting this moment for months, and her revenge was already in motion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as the younger sister to Victoria Chen had taught Rachel one fundamental truth. Victoria could not bear to see anyone else succeed, especially not her. While Rachel had spent her childhood quietly excelling in academics and art, Victoria had commanded attention through dramatics, manipulation, and an uncanny ability to make every family gathering revolve around her latest crisis or triumph. Their parents, Linda and David Chen, owned a successful chain of boutique hotels in Northern California. They had worked tirelessly to build their empire from a single bed and breakfast in Napa Valley into a respected hospitality business. The success had afforded their daughters every advantage: private schools, summer camps in Europe, and trust funds that ensured financial security. Yet, despite having identical opportunities, the sisters had developed along drastically different paths. Rachel had channeled her privileges into purpose. She graduated summa cum laude from Stanford with a degree in environmental engineering, then spent 3 years working for a nonprofit organization that designed sustainable water systems in developing countries. Her work had taken her to remote villages in Cambodia and Guatemala, where she had learned that true fulfillment came from service rather than recognition. Upon returning to California, she had accepted a position with a consulting firm that specialized in green building technologies, quickly earning respect for her innovative approaches to eco-friendly construction. Victoria, meanwhile, had drifted through a series of expensive colleges, changing majors every semester while accumulating debts that their parents quietly covered. She had briefly pursued modeling, then interior design, then event planning, abandoning each career path the moment it required sustained effort or criticism. By age 28, Victoria's most consistent occupation was that of a social media influencer, where she curated an image of effortless luxury while living primarily off family money. The contrast between the sisters had become more pronounced as they entered their late 20s. Rachel had met Daniel Martinez during a conference on renewable energy in San Francisco. He was a pediatric surgeon at UCSF Medical Center, 5 years older than Rachel, with kind eyes and hands that saved children's lives for a living. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on shared values and genuine compatibility rather than passion alone. Daniel had proposed on a hiking trail overlooking the Pacific Ocean, choosing a simple but elegant ring that reflected Rachel's practical nature while still honoring the significance of the moment. Victoria's romantic history, by contrast, read like a catalog of wealthy men who had briefly served as accessories to her lifestyle. She had never maintained a relationship longer than 8 months, typically discarding partners once the initial excitement faded or when they began expecting emotional reciprocity. Her approach to men mirrored her approach to careers. She preferred the fantasy to the reality, the beginnings to the commitment required for depth. When Rachel announced her engagement at their parents' anniversary dinner, the family's response had been characteristically revealing. Linda and David had embraced Daniel warmly, expressing genuine happiness for their daughter's choice. They had met him several times over the year that Rachel had been dating him, and they appreciated his stability, his dedication to his profession, and the obvious love he felt for their daughter. Rachel had glowed with quiet joy as she shared their wedding plans. A ceremony at the family's original bed and breakfast in Napa, followed by a reception in the vineyard that had been the backdrop for countless family celebrations. Victoria had offered congratulations with a smile that never reached for eyes. She had monopolized the conversation within minutes, launching into elaborate plans for her own hypothetical future wedding, despite having no current romantic prospects. She described venues she wanted to book, designers she wanted to hire, and guest lists that included celebrities she had never met but felt entitled to invite. The family had listened politely, accustomed to Victoria's need to center herself in every narrative. But Rachel had noticed the subtle shift in energy that always occurred when her sister felt overshadowed. The engagement period had passed peacefully at first. Rachel threw herself into wedding planning with the same methodical approach she applied to her engineering projects. She researched vendors thoroughly, negotiated contracts carefully, and created detailed timelines to ensure every element would proceed smoothly. Daniel proved to be an excellent partner in the process, contributing ideas while respecting Rachel's vision and handling logistics with the precision of someone accustomed to life-or-death situations. Victoria had initially maintained her supportive facade, even agreeing to serve as maid of honor when Rachel asked. She had attended dress fittings and tasting appointments, offering opinions and suggestions that seemed helpful rather than competitive. For several months, Rachel had begun to hope that perhaps her sister had finally matured, that the prospect of Rachel's happiness might inspire Victoria to examine her own patterns and choices. The first sign of trouble had emerged 4 months before the wedding. Rachel had been working late at her office when she received a call from Chateau Martineau, the exclusive venue where she and Daniel had planned to hold their rehearsal dinner. The manager, Mr. Dubois, had sounded confused and apologetic as he explained that they had received a cancellation request that afternoon from someone claiming to represent the Chen family. Rachel had felt ice form in her stomach as she listened to the details. The caller had identified herself as Victoria Chen, the bride's sister as wedding coordinator. She had claimed there had been a change in plans and provided what seemed to be legitimate contact information. The cancellation had been processed before the venue could verify the request with Rachel directly. The cancellation fee was substantial, but more troubling was the loss of the date itself. Chateau Martineau was booked solid for the remainder of the wedding season. Rachel had spent that evening frantically calling alternative venues, ultimately securing a space at a restaurant that was perfectly adequate but lacked the romantic atmosphere she and Daniel had envisioned for their rehearsal dinner. When Rachel confronted Victoria the next day, her sister had expressed shock and outrage at the suggestion that she might have been involved. Victoria had insisted that someone must have stolen her identity, perhaps a jealous acquaintance who wanted to sabotage Rachel's wedding. She had offered to help investigate the matter, suggesting they contact the police about what was obviously a case of fraud. The performance had been convincing enough that Rachel might have believed it, except for one detail. During the venue's security review, they had discovered that the cancellation call had come from Victoria's personal cell phone number. When Rachel presented this evidence, Victoria had claimed her phone had been stolen the day before, though she had never reported the theft and had continued posting on social media from the same device throughout the period in question. The pattern had continued with increasing frequency and creativity. The florist had received a call requesting that the white roses be changed to red ones, allegedly because the bride had decided red was more appropriate for a fall wedding. The photographer had been told that the couple wanted to switch from digital to film photography for a more vintage aesthetic. The catering company had been informed that several guests had severe food allergies that would require extensive menu modifications. Each incident had been traced back to Victoria through various means: phone records, email headers, or witness testimonies. Each time, Victoria had maintained elaborate explanations involving identity theft, miscommunications, or well-meaning friends who had misunderstood her casual comments about the wedding plans. She had portrayed herself as a victim of the same sabotage that was affecting Rachel, expressing frustration and bewilderment at the ongoing problems. Rachel had begun documenting each incident methodically, saving voicemails, screenshots, and written statements from vendors. She had shared her suspicions with Daniel, who had initially urged her to give Victoria the benefit of the doubt, while quietly supporting Rachel's decision to implement security measures for their wedding plans. They had established passwords with all vendors and requested that any changes be confirmed through multiple channels before implementation. The documentation had revealed a disturbing pattern of escalation. Victoria's sabotage attempts had grown bolder and more damaging over time, suggesting she was either becoming more desperate or more confident in her ability to avoid consequences. Rachel had realized that her sister's behavior was unlikely to stop with minor inconveniences and had begun preparing for more serious interference. 3 months before the wedding, Rachel had made a decision that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. She had scheduled a meeting with a private investigator recommended by Daniel's lawyer colleague. The investigator, a former police detective named Margaret Santos, had listened to Rachel's story with professional detachment, taking notes and asking clarifying questions about timelines and evidence. Margaret had confirmed that Rachel's documentation was thorough and that the pattern strongly suggested intentional sabotage rather than coincidental mishaps. She had recommended installing security cameras in Rachel's apartment and office, monitoring Victoria's social media activity for clues about future plans, and establishing a paper trail that could support legal action if necessary. The investigation had yielded results within weeks. Margaret had discovered that Victoria had been researching wedding vendors on social media, identifying opportunities to cause maximum disruption with minimal effort. She had created fake email accounts using variations of Rachel's name and had practiced imitating Rachel's voice during phone calls to friends who had recorded the conversations unknowingly. More disturbing had been Victoria's online activity, which revealed a level of resentment and jealousy that shocked even Rachel. Victoria had been participating in forums dedicated to ruining weddings, sharing strategies with other users, and soliciting advice for increasingly elaborate schemes. She had posted photos of Rachel's dress and venue, asking for suggestions about how to cause embarrassment or chaos on the wedding day itself. The forum posts had provided Rachel with invaluable intelligence about Victoria's intentions, while simultaneously breaking her heart. The sister she had loved despite their differences, the person she had hoped might one day become a genuine friend, had been plotting to destroy the most important day of Rachel's life with the dedication and creativity that Victoria had never applied to her own goals. Armed with this knowledge, Rachel had faced a choice that would define not only her wedding day, but her relationship with her family for years to come. She could confront Victoria directly, potentially preventing the sabotage, but also alerting her sister to the investigation and giving her time to devise new strategies. She could involve their parents, who would likely attempt to mediate while minimizing Victoria's actions and pressuring Rachel to forgive and forget. Or she could let Victoria proceed with her plans while preparing a response that would finally force her sister to face consequences for her behavior. The decision had not been easy, but Rachel's years of engineering training had taught her to think systematically about cause and effect. Victoria's pattern of sabotage would likely continue throughout Rachel's life unless it was definitively stopped. Small consequences had proven ineffective, which suggested that only significant consequences might create lasting change. Rachel had spent weeks developing what she privately called her contingency plan. She had worked with Margaret to anticipate Victoria's most likely sabotage attempts and prepare countermeasures that would not only neutralize the damage, but also expose Victoria's actions to the family and wedding guests in a way that would make denial impossible. The plan had required considerable investment of time and money, but Rachel had considered it an essential insurance policy for her marriage and her future relationship with her family. She had hired backup vendors for every essential service, arranged for discreet security at the venue, and prepared evidence packages that could be distributed if necessary. Daniel had been initially resistant to the elaborate preparations, preferring a direct confrontation that would give Victoria a chance to change her behavior voluntarily. His medical training had made him inclined toward healing rather than punishment, and he had worried that Rachel's plan might escalate the conflict beyond repair. However, as the evidence of Victoria's intentions had accumulated, Daniel had come to understand that his fiancée was dealing with a problem that required strategic thinking rather than emotional appeals. He had contributed his own ideas to the contingency plan while maintaining plausible deniability about its more aggressive elements. His surgical experience had proven valuable in anticipating potential complications and developing backup strategies. The week before the wedding, Rachel had felt a strange combination of excitement and dread. She was genuinely thrilled to be marrying Daniel and celebrating with the friends and family members who had supported their relationship. The venue was beautiful, the vendors were prepared, and the weather forecast was perfect. Yet she also knew that her sister was likely planning something significant for the wedding day itself, and the uncertainty was emotionally exhausting. Victoria had been unusually attentive during the final week, volunteering to help with last-minute details and expressing enthusiasm about the upcoming celebration. To anyone else, she would have seemed like the ideal maid of honor, supportive and invested in making the day special for her sister. But Rachel had learned to read the subtle signs of Victoria's manipulation. The excessive enthusiasm that masked calculation, the helpful offers that positioned her to access sensitive information, the constant questions about timeline and logistics. The night before the wedding, Victoria had insisted on staying at the bridal suite with Rachel, claiming she wanted to help with morning preparations and provide emotional support. Rachel had agreed, knowing that refusing would seem suspicious and preferring to keep Victoria where she could monitor her activities. They had spent the evening with the bridal party, sharing champagne and reminiscing about childhood memories. Victoria had been charming and funny, entertaining the group with stories about their family vacations and teenage adventures. For moments at a time, Rachel had almost forgotten about the months of sabotage and documentation, remembering instead the sister who had once been her closest companion and co-conspirator. But as the other bridesmaids had departed and the suite had grown quiet, Victoria's demeanor had shifted subtly. She had become more animated, almost manic in her energy, checking her phone frequently and making casual comments about last-minute changes and surprises. Rachel had recognized the signs of someone preparing for a significant action, the nervous excitement that preceded Victoria's most dramatic gestures. Rachel had gone through her normal bedtime routine while remaining hyper-aware of Victoria's movements and behavior. She had taken a mild sleep aid to ensure she would be rested for the wedding day, but had set multiple alarms to wake herself early enough to monitor any morning sabotage attempts. The wedding morning had dawned clear and warm, with the kind of perfect California sunshine that made everything seem touched by magic. Rachel had awakened to find Victoria already dressed and preparing what she claimed was a special breakfast for the bridal party. The gesture would have been thoughtful if Rachel hadn't noticed Victoria carefully measuring portions and adding ingredients that she kept hidden from view. Rachel had politely declined the breakfast, claiming nervousness was affecting her appetite, and had instead consumed the meal she had secretly prepared the night before. She had watched as Victoria grew increasingly agitated when the other bridesmaids also declined the elaborate spread, citing their own pre-wedding jitters and desire for light meals. The morning had proceeded according to schedule, with hair and makeup artists arriving as planned. Rachel had enjoyed the pampering while staying alert for signs of Victoria's next move. Her sister had been unusually insistent about choosing Rachel's makeup colors and hairstyle, pushing for dramatic looks that would have been completely contrary to Rachel's classic, understated aesthetic. Rachel had politely overruled Victoria's suggestions while making mental notes about her sister's attempts to influence her appearance. She had wondered if Victoria was hoping to make her look ridiculous in the wedding photos, or if she was simply trying to assert control over any aspect of the day she could influence. The photographer had arrived as the bridal party was getting dressed, capturing the traditional getting ready shots that would become treasured memories. Victoria had positioned herself prominently in most photos, often stepping in front of other bridesmaids or drawing attention to herself through animated expressions and gestures. Rachel had been adjusting her veil when the florist had arrived with a concerned expression and an armload of funeral arrangements instead of the white and blush pink bridal bouquets she had ordered. The woman had explained that she had received a call that morning requesting the change, allegedly because there had been a death in the family and the wedding was being converted to a memorial service. The explanation had been so absurd that Rachel had almost laughed. Victoria had been standing directly behind her when the florist delivered the news, and Rachel had watched her sister's reflection in the mirror, noting the barely concealed satisfaction that flickered across Victoria's features before being replaced by shocked concern. This had been the moment Rachel had been anticipating for months. Victoria had finally committed an act of sabotage so blatant and ridiculous that it could not be explained away as miscommunication or misunderstanding. The funeral flowers had been the trigger Rachel had been waiting for, the signal to implement the contingency plan that would expose Victoria's behavior once and for all. Rachel had expressed appropriate shock and disappointment about the flower mix-up while privately texting a coded message to Margaret Santos, who was stationed nearby with backup bouquets and a video camera. The plan they had developed was about to be set in motion, and Rachel felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with anticipation. Victoria had immediately volunteered to call the florist and try to resolve the situation, offering to drive to the flower market herself if necessary to secure replacement bouquets. She portrayed herself as the helpful sister swooping in to save the day, and her performance had been convincing enough that the other bridesmaids had praised her quick thinking and generosity. But Rachel had politely declined Victoria's offer, explaining that she had backup plans for exactly this type of situation.
She had watched her sister's confusion and growing alarm as Margaret had appeared within minutes with perfect replacement bouquets, followed by a backup photographer who had been discreetly documenting the morning's events from an adjacent room. Victoria had begun asking questions about the backup vendors and the photographer she didn't recognize, her voice taking on the sharp edge that appeared when she felt her control slipping. Rachel had provided vague explanations about wedding insurance and vendor guarantees, while internally counting down the minutes until the next phase of her plan would unfold. The transportation to the ceremony site had proceeded without incident, though Rachel had noticed Victoria making several phone calls that she had claimed were related to confirming arrival times and coordinating with the venue staff. Rachel had suspected that her sister was making last-ditch attempts to cause disruption, but her own security measures were too comprehensive to be undermined by last-minute phone calls. The ceremony site at the family's original bed and breakfast had been transformed into a romantic paradise with flowing fabric, twinkling lights, and the perfect replacement flowers creating an atmosphere of enchanted elegance. Rachel had felt a surge of pride and joy as she saw the vision she and Daniel had created coming to life exactly as planned. Daniel had been waiting at the altar in his perfectly tailored navy suit, his face glowing with happiness and love as he watched Rachel approach down the petal-strewn aisle. For a moment, all thoughts of Victoria and Sabotage had faded as Rachel focused on the man she was about to marry and the commitment they were making to each other. The ceremony had been beautiful and meaningful, with personal vows that had brought tears to many guests' eyes and traditional elements that honored both families' cultures. Rachel had felt completely present in the moment, savoring every word and gesture as she and Daniel had officially become husband and wife. But as the newlyweds had walked back down the aisle together, Rachel had caught sight of Victoria's expression and had known that her sister's most dramatic sabotage attempt was yet to come. Victoria had been watching the celebration with barely concealed resentment, her smile brittle and her posture tense with suppressed energy. The cocktail hour provided a brief respite as guests had mingled and congratulated the couple while sipping champagne and enjoying hors d'oeuvres. Rachel moved through the crowd graciously, accepting compliments on her dress and the ceremony, while keeping one eye on Victoria's location and behavior. Victoria had been circulating among the guests as well, but her conversations had seemed more intense than celebratory. Rachel had noticed her sister speaking earnestly with several relatives and family friends, gesturing animatedly and occasionally glancing toward Rachel with expressions that suggested she was sharing concerning information. Margaret Santos had been monitoring Victoria's conversations through discreet audio surveillance, and she had texted Rachel periodic updates about her sister's activities. Victoria had been telling guests that Rachel was making a mistake marrying Daniel, claiming she had information about his character that she hadn't wanted to share before the wedding, but felt compelled to reveal. The specific allegations had been vague but damaging, suggesting that Daniel was unfaithful, financially irresponsible, or hiding aspects of his medical practice that would eventually cause scandal. Victoria had been careful to present herself as a reluctant whistleblower who was only speaking up because she loved her sister too much to watch her make a life-ruining mistake. Some guests had been receptive to Victoria's warnings, particularly elderly relatives who remembered Rachel as a quiet child and had always seen Victoria as the more worldly and sophisticated sister. Others had been skeptical, especially those who knew Daniel personally and could not reconcile Victoria's claims with their own experiences with him. Rachel had been prepared for this strategy as well. Margaret's investigation had uncovered Victoria's tendency to spread malicious gossip when other sabotage attempts failed, and they had developed a plan to counter false allegations with documented evidence of Victoria's patterns of deception. As the cocktail hour had drawn to a close and guests had begun moving toward the reception area, Victoria had approached Rachel with her most dramatic gesture yet. She had been carrying a glass of red wine, despite the fact that only white wine and champagne had been served during cocktails. Victoria had positioned herself directly in front of Rachel, blocking her path to the reception area and drawing the attention of nearby guests. Her voice had been loud enough to carry clearly as she had announced that she could not allow her sister to make the biggest mistake of her life without attempting one final intervention. The performance had been carefully choreographed to maximize drama and ensure maximum witness involvement. Victoria had claimed that her conscience would not allow her to remain silent about Daniel's true character, that family loyalty required her to speak truth even when it was painful and unwelcome. She had begun recounting elaborate stories about Daniel's alleged misdeeds, each tale more outrageous than the last. According to Victoria, Daniel had been secretly gambling away his savings, carrying on an affair with a nurse at the hospital, and facing a malpractice lawsuit that would bankrupt him and anyone foolish enough to marry him. The guests had listened with increasing discomfort as Victoria's voice had grown louder and her gestures more animated. Some had tried to interrupt or suggest that this was not an appropriate time for such revelations, but Victoria had pressed on with the desperate intensity of someone making a final stand. Rachel had remained calm throughout the tirade, allowing Victoria to exhaust herself with increasingly absurd accusations. She had recognized that her sister was creating exactly the public spectacle that would make the final faith of Rachel's plan most effective. When Victoria had finally paused for breath, Rachel had spoken quietly but clearly, her voice carrying to every guest who had gathered to witness the confrontation. She had thanked Victoria for her concern, but explained that she was confident in her choice to marry Daniel and looked forward to beginning their life together. Victoria had responded with fury, claiming that Rachel was being naive and stubborn, that she would regret ignoring her sister's warnings when her marriage inevitably collapsed. She had raised the glass of wine in a gesture that had seemed threatening, though whether she had intended to drink it or throw it had been unclear. Rachel had taken a step back and had calmly asked Victoria where she had obtained the red wine, since none had been served at the cocktail hour. The question had seemed trivial given the magnitude of Victoria's accusations, but it had caused Victoria to hesitate and glance around, as if suddenly realizing she had made an error. Margaret Santos had chosen that moment to emerge from the crowd, video camera in hand, and had explained to the assembled guests that she had been documenting the day's events at Rachel's request. She had announced that the camera had captured not only Victoria's current performance, but also her sabotage attempts throughout the morning, including her substitution of funeral flowers and her addition of unknown substances to the bridal party's breakfast. The revelation had created a ripple of shock and confusion among the guests, many of whom had been unaware of any problems during the day's festivities. Victoria had immediately denied any wrongdoing, claiming that Margaret was lying and that Rachel was orchestrating an elaborate deception to discredit her. But Margaret had been prepared for Victoria's denials. She had produced a tablet computer and had begun playing video footage of Victoria making phone calls to vendors while pretending to help with wedding preparations. The audio had been clear enough to document Victoria's attempts to cancel services and change arrangements without Rachel's knowledge or consent. The crowd had watched in stunned silence as months of sabotage had been revealed in undeniable detail. Victoria's voice on the recordings was unmistakably identifiable, and her actions had been clearly intentional rather than accidental. As the evidence had mounted, Victoria's denials had become increasingly frantic and implausible. She had claimed that the recordings were fabricated, that Margaret was a professional actress hired to frame her, and that Rachel had orchestrated the entire situation to gain sympathy and attention. But the most damning evidence had yet to be revealed. Margaret had produced a printed transcript of Victoria's posts on the wedding sabotage forum, complete with timestamps and screenshots that showed her sister's months-long campaign to destroy Rachel's marriage before it had even begun. The forum posts had contained details about the wedding that only someone with intimate access could have known, along with Victoria's requests for advice about causing maximum embarrassment and emotional damage. The language had been vicious and personal, revealing a level of hatred that had shocked even those guests who had known about the sisters' strained relationship. Victoria stared at the evidence in horror, realizing that her carefully constructed denials were crumbling in real time. She had made one final attempt to regain control of the narrative, claiming that her forum posts had been taken out of context and that she had only been trying to protect Rachel from making a mistake. But her explanation was interrupted by the arrival of Linda and David Chen, who had been monitoring the situation from a distance and had finally decided to intervene. Rachel's parents had looked devastated as they absorbed the evidence of Victoria's behavior, their faces reflecting the pain of discovering that one daughter had been systematically tormenting the other. Linda had approached Victoria with tears in her eyes, asking how she could have done such things to her own sister on the most important day of her life. David had remained silent, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and profound disappointment as he processed the scope of Victoria's actions. Victoria had finally seemed to realize that her usual strategies of denial and manipulation would not work in the face of overwhelming evidence and universal condemnation. She looked around at the circle of family and friends, seeing only disapproval and disgust in their expressions. In a final act of desperation, Victoria hurled the glass of red wine at Rachel's wedding dress, apparently hoping to cause at least one instance of irreparable damage before her defeat was complete.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The red wine had spread across the white silk like blood, creating exactly the kind of dramatic stain that would have ruined any normal wedding dress. But Rachel had smiled as the wine had soaked into the fabric, because this had been the moment she had been anticipating most eagerly. She had reached behind her back and had unzipped a stained dress, stepping out of it to reveal a second, identical gown underneath. The crowd had gasped in amazement as Rachel had emerged unscathed from Victoria's final attack, her backup dress as perfect and pristine as the original. She had explained calmly that she had anticipated this exact scenario and had come prepared with multiple layers of protection. Victoria had stared in disbelief as her ultimate sabotage attempt had failed as completely as all the others. The red wine had accomplished nothing except to provide final proof of her malicious intentions in front of every important person in both sisters' lives. Margaret had continued filming as Victoria had broken down completely, alternating between tears and rage as she had realized that all her months of planning and manipulation had not only failed but had been turned against her in the most public and humiliating way possible. The assembled guests had watched in fascination and horror as Victoria had been forced to confront the consequences of her actions for perhaps the first time in her adult life. There had been no escape routes, no alternative explanations, and no sympathetic allies willing to minimize her behavior or make excuses on her behalf. Linda and David had quietly asked Victoria to leave the reception, explaining that her behavior had been unacceptable and that she needed to seek professional help before they could consider rebuilding their relationship with her. The request had been delivered with love, but also with finality, making clear that Victoria's pattern of manipulation and sabotage would no longer be tolerated or enabled. Victoria had left the reception in tears, accompanied by her parents who had driven her home in devastated silence. Her departure had allowed the celebration to continue, though the mood had been somewhat subdued by the dramatic confrontation that had preceded the dinner service. Rachel had changed into her third outfit of the day, a reception dress that had been designed for dancing and celebration. She and Daniel had shared their first dance as a married couple, while their guests had gradually recovered from the shock of witnessing Victoria's downfall and had begun to focus on the joy of the occasion. The remainder of the reception had been everything Rachel had dreamed it would be: elegant, romantic, and filled with genuine celebration from people who loved and supported her marriage. The drama of the earlier confrontation had actually seemed to intensify the guests' appreciation for Rachel's grace under pressure and their happiness for her successful union with Daniel. As the evening had drawn to a close and the newlyweds had prepared to depart for their honeymoon, Rachel had reflected on the strange mixture of triumph and sadness that had characterized her wedding day. She had successfully protected herself and her marriage from Victoria's sabotage, but the cost had been the final destruction of any hope for a genuine sisterly relationship. The plan had worked exactly as designed, exposing Victoria's behavior in a way that made denial impossible and consequences inevitable. Rachel had proven that she would no longer accept being victimized by her sister's jealousy and manipulation, but victory had felt more bittersweet than satisfying, tinged with grief for the sister she had once loved and the family harmony that could never be fully restored. In the months that followed, Rachel and Daniel had built their married life with the strong foundation of mutual respect and shared values that had drawn them together initially. Their honeymoon in New Zealand had been everything they had hoped, filled with adventure and romance without any family drama or sabotage attempts. Victoria had entered therapy at their parents' insistence, though her progress had been slow and inconsistent. She had eventually acknowledged her sabotage attempts and had written a letter of apology to Rachel, though the letter had focused more on explaining her motivations than accepting full responsibility for her actions.
Rachel had chosen not to respond to the apology, feeling that her sister's words were motivated more by external pressure than genuine remorse. The wedding day confrontation had achieved its intended purpose of ending Victoria's ability to cause damage through manipulation and lies, but it had not created the foundation for rebuilding their relationship. Linda and David had struggled with their own feelings of guilt and regret, wondering how they had failed to recognize or address Victoria's destructive patterns earlier. They had made efforts to repair their relationship with Rachel while maintaining appropriate boundaries with Victoria, though the family dynamics had remained complicated and sometimes painful. Rachel had found peace in the knowledge that she had finally stood up for herself effectively, protecting not only her wedding day but also her future marriage from her sister's interference. The elaborate planning and documentation had been exhausting and expensive, but they had been necessary to break a cycle of abuse that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. The video evidence that Margaret had compiled had become a powerful tool for helping Rachel's extended family understand the true nature of her relationship with Victoria. Many relatives who had previously seen Rachel as dramatic or oversensitive had been forced to acknowledge the reality of Victoria's manipulative behavior and the courage required to confront it. Daniel had supported Rachel's decision to maintain distance from Victoria while keeping the door open for potential reconciliation if her sister demonstrated genuine change over time. His medical background had helped him understand that personality disorders often require years of consistent therapy to address, and that Rachel's protection of their marriage had been both necessary and appropriate. As Rachel had settled into married life, she had discovered that the confidence and strategic thinking she had developed while planning her defense against Victoria had served her well in other areas of life. She had been promoted at work, had taken on more challenging projects, and had found her voice in situations where she might previously have deferred to others. The wedding dress that had been stained with red wine had been cleaned and preserved, along with the backup dress that had saved the day. Rachel had kept both gowns as reminders of her wedding day and the strength she had discovered when faced with her sister's worst behavior. Years later, when people asked Rachel about her wedding day, she would tell them it had been perfect, not because everything had gone according to plan, but because she had finally learned to plan for the people in her life who did not wish her well. The greatest gift of her marriage had not been the beautiful ceremony or the elegant reception, but the knowledge that she was capable of protecting herself and the people she loved from those who would harm them. Victoria's sabotage had ultimately backfired in the most complete way possible, not only failing to prevent Rachel's happiness, but actually contributing to her growth and empowerment. The sister who had intended to destroy Rachel's wedding day had instead provided her with the opportunity to demonstrate her strength, intelligence, and refusal to be victimized. The revenge had been perfect, not because it had been cruel, but because it had been just. Victoria had faced the natural consequences of her own actions, witnessed by the very people she had hoped to turn against Rachel. No elaborate schemes or vindictive plots were necessary. Rachel had simply documented the truth and allowed it to speak for itself. In the end, the red wine stain on the wedding dress became a symbol not of sabotage successfully executed, but of sabotage definitively defeated. Rachel wore that stain like a badge of honor, proof that she had faced her sister's worst and had emerged not only unscathed, but stronger than before. The silence in the Chen family home that evening felt different from any quiet Rachel had experienced there before. It carried the weight of shattered illusions and forced reckonings, the kind of heavy stillness that follows devastating storms.
Linda sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since grown cold, while David paced the length of their living room with the restless energy of a man whose fundamental beliefs about his family had been upended in a single afternoon. Victoria had retreated to her childhood bedroom immediately upon arriving home, refusing dinner and declining all attempts at conversation. The sound of her crying had eventually stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that concerned her parents more than the tears had. They found themselves in the unprecedented position of not knowing how to help their eldest daughter, or even whether help was what she needed most. Meanwhile, at the luxury resort where Rachel and Daniel had planned to spend their wedding night, the newlyweds were finally able to process the extraordinary events of their reception. Room service had delivered champagne and chocolate-covered strawberries, but neither felt much like celebrating. The adrenaline that had carried Rachel through the confrontation with Victoria was beginning to fade, leaving behind a complex mixture of relief, exhaustion, and unexpected grief. Daniel had changed out of his formal attire into comfortable pajamas and was sitting on the edge of the hotel bed watching his new wife as she carefully hung up her reception dress. The third outfit of the day represented the triumph of preparation over sabotage, but Daniel could see that victory felt more complicated than either of them had anticipated. Rachel had been methodical in her planning for Victoria's sabotage attempts, but she had not fully prepared herself for the emotional aftermath of watching her sister's complete humiliation. The public exposure had been necessary and justified, but it had also been profoundly sad. The woman who had thrown wine at Rachel's dress was the same person who had once taught her to braid friendship bracelets and had shared whispered secrets during childhood sleepovers. The therapy sessions that Rachel had attended during her engagement had helped her understand that grieving the loss of a relationship with a living person was one of life's most complex challenges. Victoria was not dead, but the sister Rachel had once loved and hoped to reconcile with had been revealed as someone fundamentally different from the person Rachel had believed her to be. Daniel approached the subject carefully, his medical training having taught him that trauma could manifest in unexpected ways. He asked Rachel how she was feeling, not about the success of her plan or the failure of Victoria's sabotage, but about the deeper emotional impact of the day's revelations. Rachel found herself struggling to articulate the strange combination of vindication and loss that was settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had protected herself and her marriage successfully, but at the cost of any remaining hope for sisterly reconciliation. The evidence that Margaret had compiled painted a picture of Victoria's resentment that was far more toxic and long-lasting than Rachel had realized. The forum posts in particular had been revelatory in their viciousness. Victoria had not simply been jealous of Rachel's engagement, she had been actively fantasizing about destroying her sister's happiness with a creativity and dedication that suggested deep psychological issues. The casual cruelty of her online communications shocked even Rachel, who thought she understood the extent of Victoria's capacity for manipulation. Daniel listened without offering immediate solutions or attempting to minimize Rachel's conflicted feelings. His experience with grieving families had taught him that complex emotions required time and space to process fully. He held Rachel as she finally allowed herself to cry, not for the sister she had lost today, but for the sister she had never actually had. The hotel suite felt like a sanctuary from the chaos of the wedding reception, but Rachel found herself unable to fully relax. Part of her remained on high alert, conditioned by months of anticipating Victoria's next sabotage attempt. The knowledge that Victoria's ability to cause damage had been effectively neutralized would take time to internalize fully. Margaret Santos had provided Rachel with copies of all the evidence she had compiled, along with detailed documentation of Victoria's patterns of behavior. The materials read like a psychological case study in sibling rivalry taken to pathological extremes. Rachel had requested the documentation partly for legal protection, but also because she suspected she would need concrete reminders of Victoria's actions when family pressure to forgive and reconcile inevitably began. The private investigator had also provided Rachel with recommendations for security measures and ongoing monitoring, should Victoria's behavior escalate in response to her public exposure. Margaret had worked similar cases involving family sabotage and had warned Rachel that humiliation sometimes drove manipulative individuals to more desperate and potentially dangerous actions. Daniel had initially been skeptical about the need for ongoing security measures, preferring to believe that Victoria's public embarrassment would inspire genuine reflection and behavioral change. However, the evidence of Victoria's online activities had convinced him that his new sister-in-law's issues ran deeper than typical sibling jealousy and might require professional intervention to address safely. The newlyweds had agreed to postpone their honeymoon departure by one day to allow time for family conversations and to ensure that appropriate security measures were in place at their shared apartment. Rachel's parents had requested a meeting to discuss the situation and to understand how they could best support both daughters moving forward. The conversation with Linda and David took place the following afternoon, a quiet coffee shop where they could speak privately without the emotional weight of family history that permeated both the Chen home and Rachel's apartment. Rachel had brought copies of Margaret's evidence files, while her parents had come with questions, apologies, and a painful new awareness of how badly they had misunderstood their daughter's relationship. Linda spoke first, her voice heavy with regret as she acknowledged that she and David had failed to recognize the severity of Victoria's behavior toward Rachel.
She admitted that they had consistently minimized Rachel's complaints about her sister, attributing them to normal sibling rivalry, rather than recognizing them as reports of systematic emotional abuse. The revelation that Victoria had been sabotaging Rachel's wedding for months had forced Linda to re-examine years of family interactions through a new lens. Incidents that previously dismissed as misunderstandings or personality conflicts now appeared to be part of a long-term pattern of manipulation and psychological warfare. David had spent the night reading through Margaret's documentation, and he was visibly shaken by the scope and intensity of Victoria's campaign against Rachel. As someone who prided himself on fairness and rational thinking, he was horrified to discover that he had been unknowingly enabling abusive behavior for years by treating both sisters as equally responsible for their conflicts. The forum posts had been particularly disturbing for both parents, revealing a level of hatred and calculation that seemed incompatible with their understanding of Victoria's character. The woman who posted detailed strategies for ruining weddings and destroying relationships bore little resemblance to the daughter they thought they knew. Rachel shared her own perspective on the years of sabotage and manipulation that had preceded the wedding day confrontation. She described specific incidents that her parents had either not witnessed or had misinterpreted, providing context that helped them understand how Victoria's behavior had escalated over time. The conversation was painful but necessary, allowing Rachel to finally express the frustration and hurt she had accumulated during years of being blamed for conflicts that Victoria had initiated. Her parents listened with growing horror as they realized how thoroughly they had been manipulated by their elder daughter's ability to present herself as the victim in situations where she was actually the aggressor. Linda asked what Rachel needed from them moving forward, acknowledging that their previous approach to family dynamics had been harmful and required fundamental changes.
Rachel requested that they stop pressuring her to reconcile with Victoria and that they recognize Victoria's need for professional psychological help before any family healing could begin. David inquired about the security measures that Rachel and Daniel had implemented, offering to contribute financially to any ongoing protection costs. He had been particularly troubled by Margaret's warnings about potential escalation and wanted to ensure that his daughter felt safe in her own home. The conversation concluded with tentative agreements about boundaries and communication moving forward. Linda and David would attend family therapy to address their own role in enabling Victoria's behavior, while Rachel would consider limited contact with them as they worked to rebuild trust and establish healthier dynamics. Victoria herself remained largely absent from these discussions, having refused to leave her childhood bedroom for anything beyond basic necessities. Her parents were growing increasingly concerned about her mental state, but their attempts to convince her to seek professional help had been met with rage and accusations that they were betraying her in favor of Rachel. The contrast between the sisters' responses to the wedding day confrontation was striking. Rachel had been emotionally shaken, but had processed the experience with Daniel's support and had begun making practical plans for moving forward safely. Victoria appeared to be spiraling into a crisis that she seemed unable or unwilling to address constructively. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the family therapist that Linda and David began seeing, helped them understand that Victoria's extreme reaction to accountability was consistent with certain personality disorders that made genuine self-reflection extremely difficult. The public nature of her exposure had likely triggered shame responses that she lacked the emotional tools to process healthily. Meanwhile, Rachel and Daniel finally departed for their delayed honeymoon in New Zealand, where they spent 2 weeks hiking, exploring, and gradually decompressing from the intensity of their wedding experience. The physical distance from family drama allowed Rachel to begin processing her emotions more clearly and to appreciate the strength of her marriage foundation. Daniel proved to be an ideal companion for working through complex family trauma, offering support without trying to fix problems that required time and professional help to resolve. His medical background had given him realistic expectations about the timeline for healing from psychological wounds, and he encouraged Rachel to be patient with herself as she navigated this transition. The honeymoon also provided Rachel with perspective on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few days. She had entered her wedding weekend as someone still partially defined by her sister's treatment of her, and she was returning as a woman who had successfully defended herself and her marriage against sustained attack.
The confidence that Rachel had developed through planning and executing her counter-sabotage strategy began extending into other areas of her life. She found herself speaking up more assertively at work, setting clearer boundaries with colleagues, and pursuing opportunities that she might previously have avoided due to self-doubt. Daniel noticed and encouraged these changes, recognizing that his wife was discovering aspects of her personality that had been suppressed by years of managing Victoria's hostility. The woman who had orchestrated such an effective defense against systematic sabotage was clearly capable of much more than she had previously believed about herself. Upon returning from their honeymoon, Rachel and Daniel found that Victoria's situation had deteriorated significantly during their absence. She had lost her part-time job at a boutique after failing to show up for several scheduled shifts, and her social media presence had become increasingly erratic and concerning. Victoria's Instagram account, which had previously showcased her carefully curated lifestyle, now featured rambling posts about family betrayal and conspiracy theories about Rachel's supposed manipulation of their parents. Several of her friends had expressed concern about her mental state, but Victoria had responded to their outreach with hostility and accusations. Linda called Rachel in tears, explaining that Victoria had been alternating between periods of manic energy and deep depression, sometimes not leaving her room for days at a time. Attempts to discuss therapy or medication had triggered violent outbursts, and Victoria had threatened to cut off all contact with her parents if they continued pressuring her to seek help. The situation presented Rachel with a complex ethical dilemma. On one hand, Victoria's deteriorating mental health was genuinely concerning and suggested that she needed immediate professional intervention. On the other hand, Rachel's own well-being required maintaining the boundaries she had established to protect herself from her sister's manipulation. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the therapist Rachel had begun seeing individually, helped her understand that she could feel compassion for Victoria's struggles without accepting responsibility for solving them. Victoria's mental health crisis was the natural consequence of years of avoiding accountability for her actions, and Rachel's intervention would likely enable further avoidance rather than promoting genuine healing. The therapy sessions also helped Rachel process the guilt she felt about Victoria's condition. Part of her wondered whether the public exposure at the wedding had been unnecessarily harsh, whether a private confrontation might have achieved the same protective goals without triggering such a severe psychological crisis. Dr. Martinez helped Rachel understand that Victoria's extreme reaction to accountability actually validated the necessity of Rachel's defensive measures. Someone capable of responding to exposure with healthy self-reflection would not have required such elaborate protection strategies in the first place. The therapist also pointed out that Victoria's current crisis might ultimately prove beneficial if it motivated her to seek the professional help she clearly needed. Sometimes people had to reach a point of absolute crisis before they became willing to examine their own behavior honestly and work toward genuine change. Daniel supported Rachel's decision to maintain distance from Victoria while staying informed about her condition through their parents. He had researched personality disorders extensively and understood that Rachel's involvement in Victoria's treatment could actually impede her sister's progress by providing external targets for blame rather than encouraging internal accountability. The couple established a routine of weekly check-ins with Linda and David, during which they received updates about Victoria's condition while maintaining clear boundaries about their own involvement. Rachel made it clear that she would consider resuming contact with Victoria only after her sister had engaged in sustained therapy and demonstrated genuine behavioral change. This position was difficult for Linda and David to accept initially, as they desperately wanted their family to return to some semblance of normalcy. However, their own therapy sessions were helping them understand that the previous family dynamics had been harmful and unsustainable, and that genuine healing required fundamental changes rather than superficial reconciliation. Victoria's resistance to treatment continued for several weeks, during which her behavior became increasingly erratic and concerning. She had begun making public accusations against Rachel on social media, claiming that her sister had orchestrated an elaborate campaign of psychological warfare designed to drive her to suicide. The posts were clearly delusional and bore no resemblance to the documented reality of Victoria's own sabotage attempts, but they generated sympathy from social media followers who were unaware of the full context. Several well-meaning friends and relatives contacted Rachel to express concern about Victoria and to encourage reconciliation. Linda called Rachel in tears, explaining that Victoria had been alternating between periods of manic energy and deep depression, sometimes not leaving her room for days at a time. Attempts to discuss therapy or medication had triggered violent outbursts, and Victoria had threatened to cut off all contact with her parents if they continued pressuring her to seek help. The situation presented Rachel with a complex ethical dilemma. On one hand, Victoria's deteriorating mental health was genuinely concerning and suggested that she needed immediate professional intervention. On the other hand, Rachel's own well-being required maintaining the boundaries she had established to protect herself from her sister's manipulation. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the therapist Rachel had begun seeing individually, helped her understand that she could feel compassion for Victoria's struggles without accepting responsibility for solving them. Victoria's mental health crisis was the natural consequence of years of avoiding accountability for her actions, and Rachel's intervention would likely enable further avoidance rather than promoting genuine healing. The therapy sessions also helped Rachel process the guilt she felt about Victoria's condition. Part of her wondered whether the public exposure at the wedding had been unnecessarily harsh, whether a private confrontation might have achieved the same protective goals without triggering such a severe psychological crisis. Dr. Martinez helped Rachel understand that Victoria's extreme reaction to accountability actually validated the necessity of Rachel's defensive measures. Someone capable of responding to exposure with healthy self-reflection would not have required such elaborate protection strategies in the first place. The therapist also pointed out that Victoria's current crisis might ultimately prove beneficial if it motivated her to seek the professional help she clearly needed. Sometimes people had to reach a point of absolute crisis before they became willing to examine their own behavior honestly and work toward genuine change. Daniel supported Rachel's decision to maintain distance from Victoria while staying informed about her condition through their parents. He had researched personality disorders extensively and understood that Rachel's involvement in Victoria's treatment could actually impede her sister's progress by providing external targets for blame rather than encouraging internal accountability. The couple established a routine of weekly check-ins with Linda and David, during which they received updates about Victoria's condition while maintaining clear boundaries. Rachel made it clear that she would consider resuming contact with Victoria only after her sister had engaged in sustained therapy and demonstrated genuine behavioral change. This position was difficult for Linda and David to accept initially, as they desperately wanted their family to return to some semblance of normalcy. However, their own therapy sessions were helping them understand that the previous family dynamics had been harmful and unsustainable, and that genuine healing required fundamental changes rather than superficial reconciliation. Victoria's resistance to treatment continued for several weeks, during which her behavior became increasingly erratic and concerning. She had begun making public accusations against Rachel on social media, claiming that her
Rachel found these conversations emotionally exhausting, as they required her to repeatedly explain and justify her decision to protect herself from someone who had systematically tried to destroy her happiness. The assumption that family members had unlimited obligations to tolerate abuse from relatives was deeply embedded in many people's thinking, making it difficult for them to understand Rachel's position. Margaret Santos had warned Rachel that this type of public sympathy campaign was common among manipulative individuals who faced consequences for their behavior. Victoria's ability to generate external support through selective storytelling demonstrated that her manipulative skills remained intact despite her psychological crisis. The turning point came when Victoria's online behavior escalated to making specific threats against Rachel and Daniel. She posted their home address along with claims that they were dangerous individuals who had driven her to contemplate self-harm. The posts clearly crossed the line into harassment and potentially incitement to violence. Daniel insisted on involving law enforcement at this point, despite Rachel's reluctance to criminalize her sister's mental health crisis. The threats were specific enough to constitute credible dangers, and Daniel's medical background made him acutely aware of how quickly psychological instability could escalate to physical violence. The police investigation resulted in Victoria being placed on an involuntary psychiatric hold after a wellness check revealed that she had not been eating, sleeping, or maintaining basic hygiene for several days. The intervention was traumatic for the entire family, but it finally provided Victoria with access to professional mental health treatment that she had been refusing to seek voluntarily.
Linda and David were devastated by the necessity of having their daughter involuntarily committed, but they also felt relief that she would finally receive appropriate care. The psychiatrist who evaluated Victoria confirmed that she was experiencing a severe psychological crisis that required immediate treatment and ongoing monitoring. The diagnosis process revealed that Victoria met criteria for several personality disorders that had likely been present for years but had gone unrecognized due to her ability to maintain superficial functionality. The wedding day exposure had triggered a psychological collapse that made her underlying conditions impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Rachel experienced a complex mixture of emotions as she learned about Victoria's diagnosis. Part of her felt validated that her sister's behavior had indeed been pathological, rather than simply selfish or immature. Another part felt guilty about feeling relieved that Victoria's problems had been formally recognized and would hopefully be addressed professionally. Dr. Martinez helped Rachel understand that Victoria's mental health diagnosis did not excuse her years of abusive behavior or eliminate the need for ongoing boundaries. Mental illness could explain behavior without justifying it, and Rachel's protection of herself and her marriage remained appropriate regardless of the underlying causes of Victoria's actions. The hospitalization also provided Rachel with her first extended period of safety from Victoria's interference in many years. The knowledge that her sister was receiving professional treatment in a secure environment allowed Rachel to relax vigilance that had become second nature and to focus fully on building her new marriage. Daniel observed positive changes in Rachel almost immediately after Victoria's hospitalization. His wife slept better, laughed more freely, and approached social situations with less anxiety. The constant low-level stress of anticipating Victoria's next sabotage attempt had been affecting Rachel more profoundly than either of them had realized. The couple used this peaceful period to establish traditions and routines for their married life, from weekly date nights to shared hobbies to long-term goal planning. Without the distraction of managing Victoria's hostility, Rachel was able to invest her full emotional energy in building the partnership she and Daniel both wanted. Rachel's career also benefited from her increased confidence and reduced stress levels. She took on more challenging projects at work, volunteered for leadership roles, and began considering opportunities for advancement that she might previously have avoided. Her colleagues noticed her increased assertiveness and contributions, leading to recognition and praise from supervisors. The engineering skills that Rachel had used to plan her defense against Victoria's sabotage proved valuable in other contexts as well. Her systematic approach to problem solving and her ability to anticipate potential complications made her an asset on complex projects, and she began to see how the strength she had developed through adversity could benefit her professionally. Victoria's treatment progressed slowly and inconsistently during her first month of hospitalization. The psychiatrist explained to Linda and David that personality disorders were among the most challenging mental health conditions to treat, requiring years of sustained effort and genuine commitment to change. Many patients with similar diagnoses never achieved significant improvement. The initial treatment phase focused on stabilizing Victoria's acute symptoms and helping her develop basic coping strategies for managing emotions without lashing out at others. The work was difficult and often frustrating, as Victoria continued to blame external circumstances and other people for her problems rather than accepting responsibility for her own behavior. Group therapy sessions were particularly challenging for Victoria, as other patients quickly recognized her manipulative tendencies and refused to provide the sympathy and validation she sought. The structured environment made it impossible for her to control narratives or present herself as a victim, forcing her to confront the reality of her own actions. Individual therapy proved somewhat more productive, as Victoria's psychiatrist had extensive experience working with personality disorders and was not susceptible to manipulation tactics. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, coincidentally sharing a surname with the man who had intervened at Rachel's wedding, specialized in treating patients who had damaged relationships through abusive behavior. Dr. Walsh explained to Victoria that recovery would require acknowledging the harm she had caused to others, developing genuine empathy for her victims, and learning entirely new ways of relating to family members. The process would be long, difficult, and uncertain, with no guarantee of success even with full commitment to treatment. Victoria's initial response to this treatment framework was predictably resistant. She continued to insist that she had been protecting Rachel from making a mistake by marrying Daniel, and that her family's reaction to her efforts had been disproportionate and cruel. The idea that she needed to fundamentally change her approach to relationships felt like an attack on her identity. However, as weeks passed and Victoria remained isolated from her usual sources of external validation, she began to experience moments of clarity about her own behavior. The structured environment and consistent therapeutic intervention gradually created small openings for self-reflection that had never existed in her previous lifestyle. The breakthrough came during a family therapy session that included Linda and David, but not Rachel, who was not yet ready for direct contact with Victoria.
Dr. Walsh had prepared Victoria's parents for the session by explaining that personality change required confronting extremely uncomfortable truths, and that their support for honesty would be crucial for any progress to occur. Victoria had initially attempted to use the session to recruit her parents as allies against Rachel and Daniel, presenting herself as the victim of a family conspiracy. However, Linda and David had been working with their own therapist to understand their role in enabling Victoria's behavior, and they were better prepared to respond to manipulation attempts. When Victoria claimed that Rachel had always been jealous of her and had orchestrated the wedding confrontation to gain sympathy, David responded with specific examples of Victoria's documented sabotage attempts. He read directly from Margaret's evidence files, making it impossible for Victoria to deny or reframe her actions. Linda added her own observations about patterns she had previously ignored or rationalized away, describing incidents from Victoria's childhood and adolescence that now appeared to be early signs of the manipulative behavior that had culminated in the wedding sabotage. Her tone was loving but firm, making clear that denial was no longer an option. The confrontation with undeniable evidence and unified family recognition of her behavior triggered an emotional crisis for Victoria that was both devastating and potentially therapeutic. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she was forced to confront the reality that her actions had consequences and that her family would no longer enable her manipulation. Dr. Walsh guided Victoria through the immediate emotional aftermath of this realization, helping her understand that the shame and despair she was experiencing were normal responses to genuine accountability. The therapist explained that these painful emotions were actually signs of psychological health, indicating that Victoria retained the capacity for remorse that could motivate behavioral change. The session marked the beginning of a slow and fragile process of genuine self-examination for Victoria. She began to acknowledge specific instances where she had deliberately hurt Rachel, though her admissions were often accompanied by explanations and justifications that revealed how difficult it was for her to accept full responsibility for her choices. Dr. Walsh worked with Victoria to identify the thought patterns and emotional triggers that had driven her sabotage behavior, helping her understand how her own insecurities and need for control had manifested as cruelty toward her sister. The work was exhausting and often triggered setbacks, but it represented the first genuine progress toward accountability that Victoria had ever made. Meanwhile, Rachel continued to focus on building her new life with Daniel, while staying informed about Victoria's treatment progress through their parents. The reports were encouraging but also realistic about the long timeline required for meaningful change in someone with Victoria's diagnosis. Rachel found herself cautiously hopeful about the possibility of eventual reconciliation, while also accepting that such reconciliation might never occur or might not look like a traditional sisterly relationship. The important thing was that Victoria was finally receiving appropriate treatment and that Rachel was no longer responsible for managing her sister's behavior or emotions. The distance from family drama also allowed Rachel to appreciate how much she had grown through the experience of defending herself against Victoria's sabotage. The woman who had carefully planned and executed such an effective counter-strategy was stronger and more confident than the person who had simply endured years of abuse while hoping for change. Daniel continued to support Rachel's healing process while also pursuing his own interests and career goals. Their marriage was developing into the partnership they had envisioned, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than crisis management and damage control. The couple began discussing long-term plans for children, travel, and career advancement. Conversations that would have been impossible while Victoria's sabotage attempts created constant uncertainty and stress. The knowledge that they had successfully weathered such a severe challenge early in their marriage gave them confidence in their ability to handle future obstacles together. Rachel's relationship with her parents also continued to improve as Linda and David worked to understand and change their own patterns of behavior. The family therapy they were attending helped them recognize how their differential treatment of the sisters had contributed to Victoria's sense of entitlement and Rachel's feelings of invisibility. The process of rebuilding trust was slow and sometimes frustrating, as years of minimized concerns and dismissed complaints could not be addressed quickly. However, Linda and David's genuine commitment to change and their acknowledgement of past mistakes provided a foundation for gradual healing of their relationship with Rachel. Victoria's hospitalization was eventually extended beyond the initial involuntary hold, as she agreed to continue treatment voluntarily. The structure and support of the therapeutic environment had become preferable to the chaos and isolation she had been experiencing at home, and she was beginning to recognize that she needed help to function effectively in the world. Dr. Walsh explained to Victoria's family that the transition from hospital-based treatment to outpatient care would be crucial and potentially dangerous. Many patients with personality disorders experience setbacks when they return to environments where their old behavioral patterns had been established and reinforced. The treatment team developed a comprehensive discharge plan that included ongoing individual therapy, group sessions, family therapy, and medication management for Victoria's depression and anxiety symptoms. The plan also included specific guidelines for family interactions that would support Victoria's recovery while protecting other family members from manipulation. Rachel was consulted about these guidelines but was not pressured to commit to any specific level of contact with Victoria upon her discharge. Dr. Walsh emphasized that Rachel's own well-being was equally important and that she should not sacrifice her mental health for the sake of Victoria's recovery process. The guidelines included recommendations that any contact between the sisters initially occur in supervised therapeutic settings, that Victoria demonstrate sustained behavioral change before unsupervised interaction, and that clear consequences be established for any return to manipulative or abusive behavior. Rachel appreciated the structured approach to potential reconciliation as it provided protection against pressure to forgive prematurely while leaving open the possibility of rebuilding their relationship if Victoria made genuine progress. The guidelines also acknowledged that reconciliation was not guaranteed and that Rachel had the right to maintain permanent boundaries if necessary for her own well-being. As Victoria's discharge date approached, Rachel found herself experiencing anxiety about her sister's return to the outside world. Even with all the therapeutic intervention and structured support, there remained uncertainty about whether Victoria would maintain her progress or revert to old patterns when faced with real-world stressors and temptations. Dr. Martinez helped Rachel understand that this anxiety was normal and appropriate given her history with Victoria. The fear of renewed sabotage or manipulation was based on years of experience and should be respected rather than dismissed as overreaction. The therapist also helped Rachel develop strategies for managing her own emotional responses if Victoria did experience setbacks in her recovery process. Rachel's well-being could not be dependent on Victoria's progress, and she needed to maintain her own support systems and coping strategies regardless of Victoria's choices.
Daniel proved to be an invaluable source of stability and perspective during this period of uncertainty. His medical background helped him understand both the potential for genuine recovery and the realistic possibility of relapse in patients with personality disorders. The couple agreed that they would cautiously support Victoria's recovery efforts while maintaining firm boundaries about their own safety and well-being. They would not allow hope for reconciliation to override the practical protections that had proven necessary in the past. Rachel's growth through this experience had taught her that love and boundaries were not mutually exclusive, and that protecting herself from abuse was actually an act of self-love rather than selfishness. These insights would serve her well regardless of how Victoria's recovery journey progressed. The wedding day confrontation that had once seemed like an ending was beginning to reveal itself as a beginning. Victoria's sabotage attempts had failed, not only to prevent Rachel's happiness, but had actually catalyzed growth and healing that might never have occurred otherwise. Rachel looked forward to whatever came next with cautious optimism, confident in her own strength and in the solid foundation she had built with Daniel. The future remained uncertain, but she was no longer afraid of it. 2 years had passed since the wedding day confrontation that changed everything for the Chen family. Victoria had been discharged from the psychiatric facility 8 months earlier, moving into a supervised living arrangement that provided structure while allowing her to practice the skills she had learned in treatment. Her progress was gradual and uneven, marked by small victories and occasional setbacks that reminded everyone how fragile her recovery remained. The woman who emerged from intensive therapy bore little resemblance to the manipulative saboteur who had thrown wine at Rachel's wedding dress. Victoria spoke more quietly now, choosing her words carefully and often pausing to consider her motivations before acting. The transformation was profound enough that even skeptical family members had begun to believe that genuine change was possible. Dr. Walsh had warned that personality disorders required lifelong management rather than simple cure, but Victoria had demonstrated consistent commitment to her treatment plan. She attended individual therapy twice weekly, participated in group sessions, and had begun volunteering at a local animal shelter, where her interactions were structured and supervised. The volunteer work had proven therapeutic for Victoria in unexpected ways. Working with abandoned and abused animals had given her insight into the impact of trauma and neglect, helping her understand how her own behavior had affected others. The animals' straightforward responses to kindness versus manipulation provided immediate feedback that human relationships had often obscured. Rachel had maintained minimal contact with Victoria throughout the recovery period, communicating primarily through their parents and Dr. Walsh. The few supervised meetings they had shared in therapeutic settings had been cordial but distant, with Victoria expressing appropriate remorse while Rachel remained cautiously guarded. The breakthrough in their relationship came unexpectedly during a family therapy session that Dr. Walsh had suggested after Victoria completed 18 months of individual treatment. Rachel had agreed to participate reluctantly, motivated more by her parents' hopes than her own expectations. Victoria had prepared a letter that she read aloud during the session, taking full responsibility for years of sabotage and manipulation without offering excuses or seeking sympathy. The letter demonstrated a level of self-awareness and accountability that surprised everyone present, including Dr. Walsh, who had guided Victoria through the difficult process of writing it. The most significant moment came when Victoria acknowledged that Rachel had every right to never forgive her, and that any future relationship would need to be built entirely on Rachel's terms. This recognition of Rachel's autonomy represented a fundamental shift from Victoria's previous assumption that family relationships were obligatory regardless of behavior. Rachel found herself unexpectedly moved by her sister's presentation, not because it erased years of hurt, but because it demonstrated genuine understanding of the damage that had been done. For the first time since childhood, Victoria seemed to see Rachel as a separate person with valued feelings, rather than as an extension of her own needs and insecurities. The session concluded with tentative agreements about limited contact under continued supervision. Victoria would send monthly letters updating Rachel about her progress, and they would meet quarterly in Dr. Walsh's office to assess how their relationship might evolve. The structure provided safety for Rachel while acknowledging Victoria's efforts to change. Daniel had supported Rachel's decision to engage in limited reconciliation while maintaining healthy skepticism about Victoria's long-term prognosis. His medical training had taught him that sustainable behavioral change required years of consistent effort, and he remained alert to signs of manipulation or regression. The couple's marriage had continued to flourish during Victoria's treatment period. They had purchased a house in a quiet neighborhood, adopted a rescue dog named Charlie, and were expecting their first child. The pregnancy had brought unexpected joy and anticipation, along with renewed appreciation for the stability they had built together. Rachel's career had also advanced significantly during the 2 years since her wedding. Her confidence and problem-solving skills had earned recognition at work, leading to a promotion to senior project manager and opportunities to lead major infrastructure projects. The strength she had discovered through defending herself against Victoria's sabotage had translated into professional success and personal satisfaction.
Linda and David had made remarkable progress in their own therapy, acknowledging patterns of favoritism and enabling that had contributed to both daughters' problems. They had learned to set appropriate boundaries with Victoria while rebuilding trust with Rachel through consistent supportive actions rather than mere words. The elder Chens had also begun contributing to Victoria's treatment costs and recovery support, viewing it as an investment in their family's healing rather than simply helping their troubled daughter. Their approach had shifted from rescue and excuse-making to accountability and appropriate assistance. Margaret Santos had remained available for security consultation, though her services had been needed less frequently as Victoria's behavior stabilized.
The private investigator had become something of a family friend, occasionally joining Rachel and Daniel for dinner and sharing updates about other cases involving family sabotage and recovery. Margaret's professional experience had provided Rachel with perspective on how unusual successful recovery was in cases similar to Victoria's. Most people with severe personality disorders either refused treatment entirely or abandoned it when the work became difficult. Victoria's sustained engagement with therapy represented a meaningful accomplishment, regardless of future outcomes. The animal shelter where Victoria volunteered had become an unexpected source of healing for the entire family. Rachel had begun visiting occasionally, not to see Victoria, but to support the organization's mission. These visits had allowed the sisters to interact naturally around shared activities rather than focusing directly on their relationship issues. During one such visit, Rachel had witnessed Victoria's genuine tenderness with a severely traumatized dog that had been rescued from an abusive situation. The patience and empathy Victoria displayed suggested that her capacity for compassion was developing authentically rather than being performed for therapeutic benefit. Dr. Walsh had explained that genuine empathy development was one of the most challenging aspects of personality disorder treatment. Many patients learned to simulate appropriate emotional responses without actually experiencing them. Victoria's spontaneous kindness toward vulnerable animals suggested that her emotional growth was becoming internalized rather than remaining purely behavioral. The pregnancy had initially created anxiety for Rachel about potential future conflicts over grandchildren and family involvement. However, Victoria's response to the news had been appropriately congratulatory and respectful of boundaries, without attempts to insert herself into the situation or create drama around the announcement. Victoria had asked Dr. Walsh to help her write a letter to Rachel about the pregnancy, expressing happiness for her sister's growing family while acknowledging that she had no right to expect involvement in the child's life. The letter had demonstrated remarkable restraint and self-awareness compared to Victoria's historical patterns of making everything about herself. Rachel had been touched by the letter's genuine warmth and appropriate boundaries, leading her to consider whether limited contact with Victoria might be possible once the baby arrived. The decision would depend on Victoria's continued progress and Rachel's comfort level, but the possibility existed in ways that had seemed impossible 2 years earlier. Daniel had been amazed by the transformation he had witnessed in both sisters through their respective healing journeys. Rachel had evolved from someone who endured abuse silently to a woman who protected herself and others decisively. Victoria had progressed from a manipulative saboteur to someone capable of genuine remorse and behavioral change. The couple had discussed how their experience with family trauma and recovery would influence their parenting approaches. They were committed to raising children who understood the difference between love and enabling, who could set healthy boundaries while maintaining compassion for others' struggles. Their home had become a sanctuary where both Rachel and Daniel could pursue their individual interests while building their shared life together. The guest room that had once been prepared for potential security concerns now served as a nursery, painted in soft yellows and greens to welcome their coming daughter. Rachel's baby shower had been a small gathering of close friends and supportive family members, notably excluding Victoria, who had not requested an invitation. The event had been joyful and peaceful, allowing Rachel to celebrate her pregnancy without the anxiety that family gatherings had previously generated. Victoria had sent a thoughtful gift for the baby through their parents, along with a card expressing hopes for the child's health and happiness. The gesture had been appropriate and restrained, suggesting that Victoria was learning to participate in family celebrations without centering herself in them.
The birth of Rachel's daughter, Emma Claire Martinez Chen, had been a transformative experience that brought unexpected clarity about family relationships and priorities. Holding her newborn child, Rachel had felt overwhelming protective instincts that helped her understand how deeply her own parents must have struggled with Victoria's problems. Victoria's response to Emma's birth was a crucial test of her recovery progress. She had sent a beautiful handmade blanket through Dr. Walsh, along with a letter expressing gratitude that Rachel was experiencing the joy of motherhood. The gift and message had been loving without being intrusive, demonstrating significant growth in Victoria's ability to celebrate others' happiness. Linda and David had been devoted grandparents from Emma's first day, providing support and assistance without overstepping boundaries that Rachel and Daniel had established. Their own therapy work had taught them to respect their daughter's autonomy while expressing their love through appropriate actions. The christening ceremony for Emma had presented the first opportunity for Victoria to attend a family celebration since the wedding disaster. After extensive discussion with Dr. Walsh and family members, it was decided that Victoria could attend the church service but not the reception, allowing her to participate in the spiritual significance while maintaining appropriate limitations. Victoria had attended the christening with dignity and restraint, sitting quietly with their parents and focusing entirely on the ceremony rather than attempting to draw attention to herself. Her behavior had been exemplary, suggesting that she was genuinely committed to supporting family celebrations rather than disrupting them. After the service, Victoria had approached Rachel with permission from Dr. Walsh to offer a brief personal congratulation. The interaction had been warm but appropriately brief, with Victoria expressing joy for Rachel's family without attempts to extend the conversation or create additional contact opportunities. Rachel had been surprised by how comfortable the interaction felt, recognizing that Victoria's presence no longer triggered the anxiety and vigilance that had once been automatic responses. The healing that both sisters had achieved was evident in their ability to share the same space peacefully. Emma's presence had begun to create new dynamics within the extended family, providing positive focus that helped everyone practice healthier relationship patterns. Victoria had made clear that she expected no involvement in Emma's life beyond what Rachel chose to offer, demonstrating respect for parental autonomy that marked significant progress. Dr.
Walsh had begun discussing the possibility of eventually reducing the frequency of Victoria's therapy sessions while maintaining monthly check-ins and family sessions as needed. The transition to less intensive treatment would be gradual and carefully monitored, with immediate return to full therapy if concerning behaviors emerged. Victoria had expressed both pride and anxiety about the prospect of increased independence, recognizing that maintaining her progress without intensive support would require ongoing vigilance and commitment. She had developed strong coping strategies and support networks, but understood that personality disorder management was lifelong work. Rachel had begun to cautiously consider what a future relationship with Victoria might look like if recovery continued successfully. She envisioned limited but genuine contact, perhaps occasional family dinners or holiday celebrations, where Victoria could participate appropriately in family life without causing stress or conflict. The wine-stained wedding dress still hung in Rachel's closet, preserved as a reminder of the day she had finally stood up for herself effectively. Beside it hung Emma's christening gown, representing hope and new beginnings that had grown from the ashes of old family patterns. Daniel often reflected on how the wedding day confrontation had ultimately strengthened their marriage by establishing clear principles about protecting their relationship from external interference. The lessons they had learned about setting boundaries and supporting each other through crises would serve them well throughout their lives together. Margaret Santos had begun using the Chen family case as an example in her professional presentations about successful intervention in family sabotage situations. The combination of strategic documentation, appropriate consequences, and therapeutic support had created conditions where genuine healing became possible rather than merely damage control. Victoria's recovery had inspired her to consider helping others who struggled with similar issues. She had begun discussing with Dr. Walsh the possibility of eventually sharing her story in therapeutic settings, helping other patients understand that change was possible even after causing significant harm to loved ones. The animal shelter had offered Victoria a paid position as their volunteer coordinator, recognizing her dedication and natural ability to work with both animals and volunteers.
The opportunity represented meaningful progress toward independent living and purposeful contribution to her community. Rachel's engineering firm had begun consulting on projects involving therapeutic facility design, drawing on her personal experience with mental health treatment environments. Her unique perspective on how physical spaces could support or hinder recovery processes had proven valuable in creating more effective treatment facilities. The Chen family dynamics continued to evolve as each member maintained their individual therapy work while gradually rebuilding connections with appropriate boundaries and realistic expectations. The process was slow and sometimes setback, but represented genuine progress toward healthier relationships. Emma's first birthday party had included Victoria for the first time since the wedding, marking a significant milestone in the family's healing journey. Victoria had brought an appropriate gift, interacted warmly but respectfully with family members, and left at the designated time without attempting to extend her stay. Rachel watched Victoria playing gently with Emma during the party, seeing glimpses of the sister she had once hoped to have. The moment was bittersweet, representing both loss of what might have been and possibility for what could still develop with continued effort and time. As Emma grew from infant to toddler, Rachel found herself grateful for the strength she had developed through surviving Victoria's sabotage and protecting her own well-being. These same qualities served her well as a mother, helping her provide Emma with security and confidence while teaching appropriate boundaries. The wedding revenge that had seemed so dramatic and necessary 2 years earlier now appeared as simply one chapter in a longer story of family growth and healing. Rachel had learned that true victory was not about defeating others, but about protecting herself and those she loved while remaining open to genuine change when it occurred. Daniel continued to marvel at his wife's resilience and wisdom throughout their family's challenges. The woman who had calmly stepped out of a wine-stained wedding dress had become an even more remarkable mother and partner, using her experiences to build rather than destroy. Victoria's progress remained imperfect and required ongoing attention, but her commitment to change had proven genuine enough to cautiously rebuild limited family connections. The sister who had once been Rachel's greatest source of stress had become someone who might eventually contribute positively to family life. Dr. Walsh concluded her formal involvement with the family by noting that the Chen case represented one of the most successful recoveries from severe family dysfunction that she had witnessed in her career. The combination of appropriate consequences, professional treatment, and genuine commitment to change had created lasting positive outcomes for all involved. Rachel closed the chapter on her wedding day revenge by finally donating the wine-stained dress to a program that provided formal wear to disadvantaged young women. The dress was cleaned and altered, transformed from a symbol of sabotage into an opportunity for someone else's special celebration. The final lesson of Rachel's journey was that protecting herself had ultimately protected everyone in her family by creating conditions where truth and healing became possible. The revenge that had started as defense against sabotage had evolved into a foundation for genuine family recovery and growth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.